The 16th of September 2008. Perhaps to many an irrelevant date. Perhaps to some even a date that you were too young to even remember. But little did many know that the 16th of September 2008 would change the way many games were played. It was the release of Mount & Blade. Created over the years by Yamaga Nyavus and a few others, the title wasn't anything all that special, or at least in many people's eyes. It was just a small indie game by a tiny studio by a few people. Yet slowly and surely, it shifted the way this small niche genre was played, soon bringing it up into a mainstream audience. This is how Mount & Blade defined medieval combat in gaming. There were a few iterations of the game before it came out in a big way, starting as a small project back in 2004, then releasing as a beta test that went by the name Warrider. The first test had some weirder takes on the medieval genre, with plans for the undead faction and skeleton warriors to be a mainstay in the game, yet of course that never came to be, perhaps for the best. Yet despite all the differences in that first test, what we got here was a clear base start, a compilation of ideas that would soon become a medieval sandbox, the next generation of game that we know today. Warrider went away for a while, but then to release as another beta test, but it had a different name now, Mount & Blade. More and more tests came out as the game became more and more formed, but with this name change and a new version of Mount & Blade came one big mechanic that would be the cornerstone that everything else in the title would shape around: directional sword fighting. Medieval games in 2008 weren't exactly rampant. The mainstream historical titles that were taking the forefront of this more niche genre were things like Age of Empires, that had been on its third title by this point, and of course there was Total War, about to release Empire, but recently having a massive boom with Medieval 2, still one of the most beloved in the franchise. Yet both these titles were still strategy games, never really heading into much of a combat focus. Mount & Blade records Sid Meier's Pirates as one of the games that influenced its development, but even here the sandbox campaign was really the main focus that they took. When you head into combat itself in Sid Meier's Pirates, well, you can see where the issues lied. Then we have Daggerfall, incredibly outdated even by the point of Mount & Blade's release, but still being a massive inspiration for the RPG portion of the game. So as we can see, all these titles, Total War, Sid Meier's Pirates and Daggerfall, all have elements in the Mount & Blade campaign, but one massive mechanic was missing, and that was the combat. So before we look into it, how does it actually work? It all started with the basis of an omnidirectional system, 4 basic ways to attack and defend: right, left, up, and down. Unlike most games at that time where the basic of combat is, well, left click to attack and right click to defend, Mount & Blade would take that core, yet attach precision and reading of the enemy's movements into the equation. If your opponent was going for an overhead strike, you'd have to block upwards. If they did a backhand left swing, you would have to block to your right. Sometimes they'd even go in for a stab, and that would warrant a low block on your part. This as a basis was great, but it did come with some drawbacks, specifically to a small indie team with little animation knowledge on their side. Because of this new system where players would have to read the enemy's attacks before they hit, Tails knew that reading enemies' movements would be way too hard if the attack movements were too subtle. So they had to make every attack look completely over the top, so it was obvious the way that the attack was going to go. Unfortunately, with somewhat lack of animation knowledge and model rigging, it had some interesting outcome. I mean, it's kind of charming now, but this is why the original Mount & Blade sword fighting sometimes looked a bit weird and clunky, like your character was dislocating his arm to get that overhead swing or block in. But this wasn't the end of it. On top of this basic 4-directional system also came variants. I mean, what if you were on horseback? How would that change it? Well, the faster your horse was going, the more damage it would do to an unsuspecting peasant that got in your way. Of course, you needed a long enough weapon to reach them though. Okay, but what if you don't have a sword? Maybe you were armed with a spear perhaps. So then, stabbing damage had just gone up tenfold. But don't bother trying to use overhead or side attacks, because bashing someone over the head with a pole is pretty useless, minimizing the damage. So the damage was completely different depending on which part of the weapon you hit the enemy with. Additionally, if you tried to thrust with a spear and the enemy was too close to your character, very little damage was outputted, as there was no momentum gained in that lack of space that you've given yourself. So positioning was also important to this combat system. This attention to detail with the type of weapon and the surface of contact was also moved pretty much to every other weapon in the game. With axes, overhead and side attacks were powerful, but a thrust would do little to no damage as there's no blade edge there. Scimitars were great at slicing and very fast in doing so, but stabbing was much less effective due to the curve of the blade. I could go on and on on with every single example. But at the time of 2008, for such a small indie title, this attention to detail was pretty much unprecedented. Then, in 2010, Mount & Blade had a little bit of a redo. After the success of the first title, Tailwords now wanted to refine it, make it a proper content-rich game from the ideas that they'd collected over the last few years. They did this with the release of Mount & Blade Warband. Most of the combat was pretty similar. Of course, the animations were fixed, making it a bit smoother, but the base was almost identical. Yet it was on another one of Warband's introductions that advanced Mount & Blade's combat to the next level, and this was the addition of multiplayer. Of course, with most games, fighting against AI is one thing, but when you give these same mechanics to real players, they will find any advantage they can to get the upper hand in a duel. Feinting, chambering, and, well, spinning to win was a famed line battle winner back in the day. This basic combat system was turned into a competitive powerhouse with incredibly fast-paced duels and battles. And on that note, this is a little clip from Gibby versus Peter, two of Warband's best duelists fighting in the final Battle of Bucharest, Mount & Blade's biggest competitive tournament back in 2017.
I feel like Gibby gave away a couple of easy duel matches, but Peter hasn't gone down easy, not one time. A lot of the time. Oh, and it goes to 6.
So we get it. Like Germany's French holiday in 1939, players took it too far. Only this time in a good way. In 2012, then, we got the release of Mount & Blade Napoleonic Wars DLC, based on the beloved Mount and Musket mod. Clans started to form, playing line battles and recreating the wars of the 1800s in the time of gunpowder and the terrifying French. With this came a new adversary for Warband's supposedly incredible combat. I mean, before this point, it was swords, axes, maces, and spears on the whole, whilst having various iterations for different weapons that had never been gunpowder coming into the equation. How would muskets and rifles now fare with this combat system? Well, pretty good as it turns out. Of course, officers and cavalry swords would be pretty much the same as what Warband had, but rifles and dragoons would now be able to switch into a melee mode that you could then use the butt of your gun to club the enemy to death. Muskets would also be able to switch to a melee mode using the bayonet on the end of the gun. However, it would limit your strikes, taking away the left and right strikes, now just high and low strikes for the way the musket was used. This limit made the musket melee combat completely different to anything that we'd seen previously. Only having 2 attack directions rather than 4 meant that players would have to devise other ways to get past their opponents. Faster chambering, feints. One of the most underrated additions, bracing. Being able to kneel down with a musket in melee mode would automatically brace your bayonet so any cavalry charging into it would instantly be dehorsed, a mechanic many people never really used, as the instinct was always to attack first, rather than just hold in place. But this added to the in-depth array and uses of Mount & Blade's combat system. The system itself was so beloved and universal that it actually went hand in hand with a massive array of mods that the game had to offer. It didn't matter if you're using swords, muskets, Roman shield wards, or even magic. This easy to use yet difficult to master combat system just worked with pretty much every mod that players threw at it. Because this system was so universal, worked with pretty much any time, era, or setting, modders were willing to transport Mount & Blade to any universe they wanted, ushering in more and more mods, which made more and more players join, growing the game even further. After the name Mount & Blade grew and grew, it slowly became a staple in the historical genre, and with it, the territory also came others. War of the Roses soon came after, not having the most successful launch and dropping off rather quickly, but it had directional combat based on Mount & Blade. We then got Chivalry, a huge success, and mostly down to its slick and famed first-person sword fighting. But really, it was mostly just a first-person and improved version of what Tailwords had created. Then, of course, it went on to inspire games like Mordhau much later. Whilst games like Chivalry and Mordhau are very unique in themselves, there's no arguing that much of its directional combat was inspired by a game like Mount & Blade. Even all the way into a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance in 2018, using a mix of both Chivalry first-person and Mount & Blade's directional combat turned it into something masterful, upping the intricacy to the max and creating something that is one of my favourite combat systems to date. Daniel Vavra, Kingdom Come's creator, even stated that Mount & Blade's combat system was one of the main inspirations for what Kingdom Come Deliverance eventually implemented. But it doesn't end here. These are just the big mainstream titles. What about the standalone spin-offs? A lot of modders from Warband decided to make their own game. Hold Fast Nations of War took the same combat from Napoleonic Wars DLC. Whigs and Tories, Battle Cry of Freedom, even to some extent War of Right. All these titles are based off mods from Mount & Blade took some of that combat system because it still holds up to this day. Is it perfect? No. Is it even that pretty? Definitely not. But Mount and Blade sword fight mechanics are so famed to this day by reviewers. You know, every time a game with melee combat comes out, it's always compared to that gold standard of which Mount and Blade created. And it is still held up to that standard even by its players. On the surface, it looks clunky and it should never really work as well as it does. But people love it. And still to this day, with games like Holdfast or Battlecry of Freedom, they're decent games. But I think most people still agree that no one's ever been able to recapture the feel and agility that Tales brought us. And that brings us on to Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord. In my opinion, I think the combat is way smoother. It's still more of the same, but even now, a lot of people argue that Warband still does it better than the sequel ever could. And in some ways, maybe that just makes it more special. A mechanic that is so unique and specific to one title and one title only that no one ever has or maybe never will be able to recreate in the same way. And that's how Mount and Blade defined medieval combat.